God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations on all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you are our rock and our liberator. Amen. So can we turn it down? Thank you. When I do cross-cultural work, both inside and outside of the church, with people of all different colors and kinds and creeds and cultures and knowledge levels, I find one of the biggest barriers to thriving diversity is unintentional ignorance. And since I preached about that last week, I won't go into it much now, but I will say for those of you who weren't here last week that ignorance isn't something to feel shame about. It's something to be motivated by. And how we go about that learning matters. It is not the job of people of color to teach white people about race or about Black history. It is the job of everyone to learn about race and Black history every day of the year, and especially with intention in February, when our culture makes good space for it. So for the next 5 weeks, everyone in here will have a unique opportunity to learn about histories that have unfortunately gone largely unseen and unheard in churches like this one. I want to encourage you to write down names you've never heard and to do research of your own by hearing books referenced and actually reading them. I want to encourage you to participate in the Koinonia Facebook threads where we're going to profile figures of Black history. And I want you to be open to seeing how all of this applies to you. It's easy to learn about other cultures and to think it's all about other people. But the real transformation happens when we learn and apply and reflect and learn and apply and reflect. And having just said all that, I think it's important to acknowledge from the outset that there has never been a Black church or a Black theology. There have always been Black churches and Black theologies. No one person is responsible for Black Christianity or Black theology in America. Multiple Black voices and multiple Black movements and multiple Black bodies have always been and still are today creating the intellectual, prophetic, and pastoral currents that make up religious life in America. There are, however, folks like Howard Thurman, Dr. King, and James Cone, and Jacqueline Grant, and Dolores Williams and Emily Towns that must be acknowledged when we talk about the emergence of Black liberation theology in America, because they are, quite frankly, the birthers of theological movements that have without fail changed the face and function of theology forever. The seeds for liberation theology in America really began with what's known as the social gospel movement in the 1900s, the very early 1900s, but the full-blown revolution of liberation theology happened in the 1960s. So Americans tend to have this really happy, soaked, marijuana, smoked-out nostalgia about the 1960s. It was a time of incredible upheaval and unrest, a time of creative expansion and social risk-taking America, a time when political and artistic and sexual freedoms were sought with delight and devastating consequences. I wasn't there. I wasn't born yet. But from all I gather, I would have loved being alive at that time. And as a person who pays real close attention to the way that nostalgia and God impact the world today, I must say that I wrestle with the narrow ways in which the 1960s get depicted in our contemporary culture, and not for the reasons that you might think. So you've seen it all, right? The tie-dye shirts and the Jimmy and Joni adoration, the songs that we can repeat in our sleep, they were so popular. So watch this, you ready? War. Huh. Good God, y'all, what is it good for?
Absolutely nothing.
Sing it again. War. Good God, y'all.
What is it good for?
Absolutely nothing. All right. So you've heard about it, the acid trips, the Vietnam protesting, the bare feet at Woodstock, the burn your bra demonstrations, the black power movements, the dandelion in some chick's hair, the bandana around some dude's head, the smiles, the sex, the freedom, yes? Yeah? So you've seen it in Forrest Gump, and you've seen it on the Wonder Years, and you've heard some baby boomers talk about it with such longing you think they're going to start foaming at the mouth. Right. Free love, free your mind, free Vietnam, free to be you and me. Freedom. It was an era, no doubt, unlike any other, where social movements and specific bodies and religious groups and political actions were all about seeking freedom. And it wasn't just happening in America. The longer I live as an American and the more I travel and talk with folks who aren't Americans, the more I'm learning that one of the things that most distinctly characterizes us Americans is our absolute ignorance of what's going on in the rest of the world, as if we are the only place that exists. And while that national navel-gazing hurts other places for sure, there's some stuff that hurts us too. So for instance, we don't know that when impulses for freedom are happening right here, they might also be happening elsewhere. And that might mean something significant about what God is trying to do here and elsewhere. So let me be very specific about this. I'm going to talk about what was happening in the world of theology in the 1960s. And while this is specific to Christian theology, much of what I cover here have similar trends in secular and non-academic disciplines all over the world. The 1960s were big all over the world because God moves all over the world. It's the point of this sermon. Freedom never comes from one place, but it emerges in the midst of multiple movements. And when we get singularly focused, we miss the movements and multiplicity outside of us that might actually be the creating and sustaining forces of large-scale freedom. So number one, on July 31st of 1966, the National Conference of Black Christians, formerly known as the National Committee of Negro Churchmen, drafted a document entitled Black Power. It was signed by almost 50 famous black clergy and laymen of various denominations. 3 years later, on April 26th of 1969, at the National Black Economic Development Conference in Detroit, Michigan, James Forman presented a document entitled the Black Manifesto that called for total control as the only solution to the economic problems of black people in general and very specific economic and institutional reparations in particular. That same year, 2 months later, the first official document outlining the specifics of black theology was drafted, issued, and adopted in Oakland, California. Hey, hey. It was a theology rooted in the belief that black power in the context of America could liberate us all from the perils of white supremacy. And here's a quote from that document. The message of liberation is the revelation of God as revealed in the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Freedom is the gospel. Jesus is the liberator. This is the message of black theology in the words of Eldridge Cleaver. We shall have our manhood. We shall have it, or the earth will be leveled by our efforts to gain it. That was 1966. How we doing? Number two, Latin America. If you ask any Catholic or liberation theologian about the biggest tectonic shift in the Catholic Church during the 20th century, they will tell you it was the Second Vatican Council of the Roman Catholic Church that happened from 1962 to 1965, where incredible spiritual creativity and institutional reform exploded. From August 26th to September 6th of 1968, an event called the Second General Conference of the Latin American Episcopal Council took place in Colombia. It was there that gathered priests, cardinals, and bishops serving Catholic families in rural spaces of the global South began publicly critiquing the colonialism of the West. These gathered churchmen specifically identified the unjust economic dependencies created by imperialism that rendered the members of their flock perpetually poor. Whereas inequitable dependency on foreign power exploited rural communities, these bishops, cardinals, and priests also witnessed a rise in what was known as Christian-based communities in Latin America, communities that gathered in people's homes around biblical text and experienced liberation together of mind and body when they learned to read the gospel in light of their own economic exploitation and God's historic solidarity with the oppressed. It was at that conference in Colombia when the word liberation started to be used consistently in official church documents and theological movements, Catholic ones, y'all. 1960s, y'all, in the Catholic Church that would eventually become Latin American liberation theology. It was a theology rooted in the belief that God's power in the context of imperial domination is always to liberate the poor from occupation and oppression. And here's a quote from one of those documents. The poor person does not exist as an inescapable fact of destiny. His or her existence is not politically neutral and is not ethically innocent. The poor are a byproduct of a system in which we live and for which we are responsible. They are marginalized by our social and cultural world. They are oppressed, exploited proletariat, robbed of the fruit of their labor, and despoiled of their humanity. And here we go. Hence, the poverty of the poor is not a call to generous relief action, but a demand that we go and build a different social order. Gustavo Gutierrez. Number 3, in Europe. In Europe, specifically in Germany, which has always been a hotbed of theological thinking, the 1960s proved to be a fertile time as well. After World War II, theologians in Germany had to take seriously the problem of evil, specifically how social institutions and masses of people can become so easily persuaded and corrupted by the likes of a man named Hitler. Theologians like Johann Metz and Jürgen Moltmann sought to take that evil in the world seriously in their writings and teachings. What became uniquely concrete in European theology in the 1960s was a critique of privatized religion. Say it with me, privatized religion. Theologians like Metz and Moltmann argued that to rebuild Europe and to rebuild the heart of humanity after devastating back-to-back world wars, the church must take its prophetic duty seriously, especially when it comes to critiquing corrupt politics and encouraging hopeful political momentum for justice. The 1960s. I quote, "The truth of human freedom lies in the love that breaks down barriers." Jürgen Moltmann. So why would such similar bursts of thinking and movement happen in such different places at the same time? The 1960s are known for being a time of freedom, but that freedom, that came about in specific response to the 20th century, which brought with it the most corrupt forms of power the world had ever seen. Freedom was the answer to the Holocaust in Germany. Freedom was the answer to the white supremacy in America. Freedom was the answer to American imperialism in Latin America. And in all those places, humans emerged from oppression saying that the church, had a role to play in the liberation of the earth and her creatures. That's how God does freedom. Not one place at a time, all places at the same time. And we can either get with that movement or not. It's like the ocean and waves. A single wave may look like it's an independent movement, but we all know that the currents necessary to bring about and sustain that wave are part of a larger rhythm of the ocean itself, deep and wide, totally interconnected. When it comes to how movements for freedom work, the difference between us and God is what we are able to see and feel. God sees and feels the struggles and needs for freedom everywhere. We can only see and feel the struggles and needs for freedom in our own lives. But God is often doing something over there something far away, in a place or in a person we don't know, that will eventually come bearing freedom right here. So our story from the Bible this morning is a popular one, but it's often thought about like most stories from the vantage points of the hero and the villain, showdown between Moses and Pharaoh. And we rarely think of this story from the perspective of God and the enslaved people. If you're a Hebrew in this story, enslaved, exploited, and under the corrupt power of Pharaoh, you might not know that God is showing up to liberate you, because God doesn't first show up in Egypt. God doesn't first show up where the oppression is happening. The Hebrews are crying out in Egypt, and God actually shows up in the land of Midian, where nomadic tribes are living between the Sinai Peninsula and northern Arabia. That's far away from where those groans are being groaned. That's far away from where those prayers are being prayed. Far away from the people living in captivity in desperate need of liberation. God shows up over there when the suffering is happening here. Why? Have any of you noticed in your own lives that big change comes about not with one or two big events, but with a bunch of disparate stuff that at first seems totally disconnected? I remember before moving to Michigan, it was like a comedy of errors happened. I hurt my back. I lost my promised financially sweet chaplaincy job in the Bay Area. I was 27 years old, and I had to move back home with my mom. Because I was unemployed and all I had was this Master's of Divinity degree that you can't do anything with, I was forced to put my profile out to look for churches, which was never in my plan. And where did I end up? Battle Creek, Michigan. I'd never heard of this place. And what have I found here? The best work of my life. My nets. Best colleagues of my life. My spouse. My 2 children. But when things were falling apart and looking impossible 5 years ago, you think I saw all that? God doesn't do freedom in a flash. God does freedom in surges, in collectives and fragments. In our biblical story, there's slavery and exploitation. There's murderous rage that leads to homicide. Y'all, Moses killed somebody. Did you get that? There's a fleeing to the wilderness from shame. There's a revelation on holy ground, and Moses is too scared to show his face to God. There's a calling for exile and return, a showdown between former brothers, a groaning people, a compassionate response. There are plagues and dashes to escape. God is in all of that. All of that. The fulfillment of freedom is in all of that. It's not just in Moses. It's not just in the burning bush. It's in all of it. So when you look at this community of faith, this koinonia community, all the people sitting here, all the histories we bring, all the gifts born of our strengths and our struggle, what freedom might God be calling us to enact in Battle Creek today? Do you know of another church in Battle Creek where a non-gender conforming kid can come and be safe? We've got work to do. Do you know any other church in Battle Creek that's willing to say white privilege from the pulpit? We've got work to do. Do you know any other church where the nursery's gone from 0 to 13 in 6 months? We've got work to do. And I'm not doing it all. When you look at your own life, where you've been, the people you've loved and who have loved you, the losses and pain you've endured or are enduring. All the gifts born of your strengths and struggle, what freedom might God be calling you to experience in your own life today? When liberation theology first began its birth in different places around the globe, it chose leaders and everyday people who were willing to name power, who were willing to engage in conflict, folks who were willing to ask hard questions like, how might our ideas about God be getting in God's way? And they got together. And they didn't seek freedom as individuals, but as collectives. There were differences of denomination and persuasion and lifestyle and age and even region, but when it came time to fighting for freedom, they got together. You know what we need in the church and in the world today? We need liberation incarnations. We need bodies and communities that don't just preach freedom, but become freedom together. And you know what that takes? That takes people and groups willing to make connections between things that don't appear connected on the surface. People who listen for common themes in different struggles. People who ride the waves underneath them and watch for the ones coming in the distance. People who move their bodies. People who physically interrupt oppression when it's happening, no matter who's doing it, no matter how it's being done. People who care more about keeping our children alive than keeping our pews warm. Is anybody hearing me right now? People who care more about keeping our children alive than keeping our pews warm. There is theology, beautiful theology, profound theology, Black and Latin American and European and feminist and queer theology that can support us in being those kind of people, liberation incarnations. And what matters most isn't what we think or say about the God of liberation, but that we actively obey that God of liberation. Amen.